laughter started before she even reached the line. It wasn't the loud kind. It wasn't the kind that fills a room and bounces off walls. It was the quiet kind. The kind that travels in sidelong glances and half-turned shoulders. The kind where men don't quite meet your eyes because they're too busy meeting each other's. Sergeant First Class Carter heard it the moment she stepped onto the range at CFB Wainwright, and she understood immediately what it meant. She had been hearing that particular sound her entire career. It was the sound of a decision already made. The morning had started with a briefing that nobody expected to go sideways. Colonel Hargrove, a compact, precise man who had spent 31 years in the Canadian Army and wore every one of them on his face, had stood at the front of the operations room and explained the situation with the kind of economy he reserved for problems he found personally embarrassing. A threat assessment had identified a high-value target operating from a fortified compound on the far edge of a valley in a training scenario classified at a level most people in that room didn't have clearance for. The scenario was live fire. The distance to the target emplacement was confirmed at 2,800 meters. 3 Ranger teams had already cycled through the problem over the past 4 days. None of them had resolved it. Carter had been sitting in the second row when Hargrove said the number out loud. 2,800 meters. She didn't write it down. She didn't need to. The men around her made small sounds, exhales, the shifting of chairs, the particular silence that happens when experienced people hear something they weren't expecting and don't yet know how to process. Staff Sergeant Morrison, who was sitting to her left and who had been with 3rd Battalion long enough to have an opinion about everything, leaned slightly forward in his chair. Carter noticed, the way she noticed most things in rooms like this, quietly, without drawing attention to the noticing. Hargrove asked if anyone had questions. A few hands went up. The questions were logistical. Wind data, elevation change, confirmed intelligence on the target position. No one asked the question that was actually in the room, which was, if 3 Ranger teams couldn't close this in 4 days, what were they going to do about it? People stood and stretched. Carter stayed in her seat for a moment, looking at the topographic map that was still projected on the wall. The valley had a particular shape, a long funnel that would compress and redirect prevailing winds in ways that didn't show up cleanly in the data. She had seen terrain like that before, in a very different context, in a place she didn't think about unless she had to. She stood, folded her notebook, and walked out. It was Monroe who said it first, or at least Monroe was the first one Carter heard. He was standing near the equipment bay with Ruiz and a younger corporal, whose name Carter had already forgotten twice. And he said it in the tone of voice people use when they want to be overheard without technically being accountable for what they've said. Something about the problem being above a certain pay grade. Something about needing someone who actually knew what they were doing. He didn't look at Carter when he said it. He didn't need to. The corporal laughed, the short, borrowed laugh of someone who doesn't have his own opinion yet and is renting someone else's. Carter walked past them without breaking stride. She had learned a long time ago that responding to that particular sound was a losing proposition, not because she couldn't argue the point. She could, and she had documentation, and she had a record that ran 12 years and 3 theaters and 1 commendation she almost never mentioned because mentioning it was exactly what Monroe would want her to do. She had learned that responding gave the sound more room to breathe, better to let it fill whatever space it could fill and wait for it to run out of air. She went to the equipment bay and began pulling her kit. The range at CFB Wainwright sits at the edge of a landscape that doesn't particularly care about the human beings moving across it. In summer, it is brown and flat, and the sky above it goes on long enough to make you feel, on bad days, like the horizon is moving away from you. On the morning Carter walked out to the long-range position, the wind was coming from the northwest at approximately 18 to 22 kilometers per hour, with gusts that didn't follow a clean pattern. She clocked it without a meter, the way you learn to clock it when you've been doing this long enough that the data stops being something you calculate and starts being something you feel. She had been shooting competitively since she was 16. That part of her life wasn't in any of the briefing documents. It wasn't the kind of thing that came up in operational assessments or unit evaluations. Her father had been a long-range shooter, recreational, never competitive, and had taken her to her first match at a range outside of Red Deer when she was 15, mostly to have company on a long drive. She had watched the adults shoot for about an hour and then asked if she could try. The range officer had looked at her father with an expression that Carter now recognized as a variant of the same expression Monroe wore in the equipment bay. Her father had shrugged. Carter had fired 7 rounds and put 5 of them in a group that made the range officer go quiet, in a way that adult men did not go quiet around 15-year-old girls very often. She didn't think about that morning often anymore, but she thought about it now, walking across the brown grass with her case in one hand and her data book in the other, and she thought about how the quiet after those 5 shots had felt the same across all the intervening years. The same texture, the same weight, the same particular quality of a room going still when something happens that wasn't supposed to be possible. The scenario had been reset that morning. The target position was confirmed. The range markers were in place, and Hargrove had come out personally to observe, which told Carter more about the pressure this problem was generating than any briefing could have. He was standing with 2 other officers near the rear observation point. Hale, who was the battalion's senior tactics instructor, and a woman Carter didn't recognize who wore the rank of major and hadn't introduced herself to anyone. Carter set up at the position without announcing herself. This was, technically, not the protocol. The protocol involved a check-in with the range officer and a confirmation that all personnel were clear. She did both of those things. She simply did them without the particular performance that some people attached to them, without the head tilting and the confident commentary and the ritual of being seen preparing. She lay prone, settled the rifle, and spent the next 9 minutes doing nothing visible. What she was actually doing during those 9 minutes was watching the grass. There is a skill, and it is a skill, not an instinct, though it can become instinct with time, of reading wind at distance by watching the way it moves across surface features. The grass at Wainwright had a particular behavior in the northwest gusts that Carter had been cataloging since she arrived on site. There was a pattern in the irregularity. The gusts weren't random. They had a cycle, loose and approximate, but a cycle nonetheless, and they were consistently 5 to 8 seconds shorter than the prevailing model suggested for this terrain type. She had noted this on her second day. She had written it in her data book in the margin, next to the elevation calculations, in handwriting that was smaller than most people's, because she had learned to economize on paper during a period in her career when data books were expensive and time in the field was long. Hargrove hadn't moved from the observation point. She could see him in her peripheral vision, not watching her specifically, but watching the position. Hale said something she couldn't hear. The major didn't respond. Carter made 3 final adjustments to her scope. She controlled her breathing. She was aware of her heartbeat in the way that long-range shooters become aware of it. Not as a distraction, but as information, as a rhythm to work around, a tide to account for. She had her support hand positioned against the stock in a way that her first instructor had called unnecessarily complicated, and that had turned out over the years to be the single most consistent variable in her shooting. She waited. The wind dropped into its cycle. She had 4 seconds, maybe 5, if the pattern held. She squeezed. The sound of a large caliber rifle firing is not the sound that films suggest. It doesn't have the clean, punctuating quality of cinema. It is heavier than that, and it lasts longer, and it displaces the air around you in a way that is physical, that you feel in your chest and your teeth. Carter was familiar enough with this sensation that it had largely stopped registering consciously. She was already tracking the round through the scope, watching the trace, making the micro calculations that happen in the gap between the shot and the result. The target indicator at 2,800 meters went down. She heard Hale say something behind her. She didn't catch the words. She cycled the bolt. There is a reason experienced shooters don't celebrate at the moment of a successful shot, and it isn't because they're performing composure. It's because the moment of the shot is not actually the end of anything. It's a data point, one of many. In an ongoing process of assessment and correction, Carter lay still for approximately 40 seconds after the indicator went down, watching the range, reading the wind, logging what the shot had told her about the conditions she'd been working with. This was not unusual behavior for someone with her background. It would have been unusual, or at least notable, to anyone watching who understood what they were looking at. Hargrove was walking toward her before she stood up. He moved the way men of his experience and rank tend to move across ground they're uncertain about, carefully, as though the terrain might have opinions. He stopped approximately 3 meters away and looked at the target position for a moment before he looked at her. Carter was brushing grass from her jacket. That was a confirmed hit, Hargrove said. It wasn't quite a statement, and it wasn't quite a question. It was the verbal equivalent of a man recalibrating. Yes, sir. He looked at the target position again. Then he looked at her data book, which she was holding closed with one hand. How long did it take you to get the wind read? 9 minutes on site, Carter said, plus 2 days of observation from the range perimeter. He absorbed this. You were reading the range before you were assigned to the problem. I was on the same base, Carter said. The wind was there. There was a pause. Hargrove had the quality, genuinely rare in people of his rank, of being able to sit inside a pause without trying to fill it. Carter had noticed this about him from the first briefing. It was one of the few things she had put in the column of reasons to believe the situation might resolve correctly. You have a competition background, Hargrove said finally. Long range. Yes, sir. That's not in your file. Recreational activity prior to enlistment, Carter said. It predated the file. He nodded once, like a man closing a calculation. Then he looked over his shoulder at Hale and the unnamed major, both of whom had moved closer during this conversation without quite admitting they were doing so. Get with Major Petrov after lunch, Hargrove said. She'll want to talk about the wind data. He walked away. He did not say anything else. No formalized acknowledgement, no ceremonial words. Carter had not expected any. She was familiar enough with men like Hargrove to understand that what he had just done, by coming to her directly and standing in the open while he did it, constituted a form of recognition that was more legible to the people watching than any speech he might have made. Major Petrov, it turned out, was a ballistics analyst out of Ottawa who had been brought in specifically because the scenario had stalled and someone above Hargrove's level had needed a new variable. She was approximately 50, with close-cropped gray hair and the focused attention of someone who had spent a long career being the person in the room that other people eventually had to listen to. She shook Carter's hand with the directness of someone who had learned that directness saved time, and she asked about the wind pattern before they had fully sat down. Carter opened her data book. They talked for 2 hours. Petrov asked questions that were specific and technical and that assumed competence. The kind of questions that Carter had learned over years to identify as a reliable signal that the person asking them was actually interested in the answer rather than in the performance of interest. She asked about the cycle timing, about the way Carter had adjusted for the elevation differential in the eastern quadrant, about the specific grip variation that Hale had apparently noticed through his binoculars and flagged to Petrov as unusual. Carter explained each thing clearly and without elaboration. Petrov wrote in her own notebook, small, precise handwriting, similar to Carter's, and asked follow-up questions that built on the previous answers, compounding the way a good conversation builds. At the end of the 2 hours, Petrov closed her notebook and said, the cycle timing you identified isn't in any of the current models for this range. Carter said she knew. You're certain about the pattern? I documented it across 41 separate observation windows over 2 days. Carter said, the shortest window was 4 minutes and the longest was 22. The cycle is real. It has variance, but the variance is consistent. Petrov looked at her for a moment. Why didn't you bring this to the teams that were working the problem? Carter considered the question. It was the most honest question anyone had asked her since the operation began, and it deserved an honest answer. I wasn't asked, she said. Petrov's expression shifted barely perceptibly. That's a problem, she said. It wasn't directed at Carter. Yes, Carter said. It is. That evening, Monroe was at the same table as Carter in the mess. He wasn't sitting near her. There was a full section of table between them. But they were in the same room, and at some point during the meal, Ruiz said something to Monroe in a low voice. And Monroe looked up, and across the distance of the room, he and Carter made eye contact for a brief, unambiguous moment. Monroe looked away first. Carter finished her meal and took her tray to the return and went back to her room and opened her data book to the page with the wind cycle documentation and added 3 additional notations she had been thinking about during the conversation with Petrov. The notes were small and precise. She dated them. She closed the book. She had not spent any energy at any point in the day being angry at Monroe. This was not because she was a particularly forgiving person or because she had achieved some elevated state of professional detachment. It was because anger at Monroe would have required giving him a kind of significance he had not earned. The laughter in the equipment bay, the look in the mess, these were things that had happened in the margins of a day whose center was somewhere else entirely. The center was the data book. The center was the 41 observation windows and the cycle timing, and the 2,800 meters of Alberta air that had been, for 9 minutes that morning, hers to understand in a way that nobody else on that range had understood it. She had done the thing. The rest of it, the sidelong glances, the borrowed laughter, the moment when Monroe had looked at the floor of the equipment bay rather than at her, these were the kind of things that accumulated into a weight if you let them. Carter had learned over 12 years not to let them. Not because the weight wasn't real, it was real. She was aware of it with the same clarity with which she was aware of the wind. You didn't pretend the wind wasn't there. You factored it in, and you adjusted, and you put the round where it needed to go. That was the job. That had always been the job. 3 days later, Hargrove's after-action report included a section on pre-observation methodology that Petrov had contributed documentation to, and that section included informal, clipped military language, a reference to the identification of a terrain-specific wind cycle that had been critical to the successful resolution of the scenario. It did not use Carter's name. It described a methodology. Carter read it once and filed it. She had been in the Army long enough to know that the methodology outlasting the moment was the only version of recognition that mattered, the kind that goes into documents, the kind that other people working the same problem in different terrain, years from now, would find in a database and use without knowing where it came from. You did the work, and the work went forward, and the work didn't need your name on it to do what it was supposed to do. She thought about that range outside of Red Deer, and her father's patience, and the range officer's silence after 5 rounds that weren't supposed to go where they went. She thought about how the world hadn't rearranged itself around that moment, how she had loaded the next round and adjusted her grip slightly, and fired again, how the work had simply continued. She picked up her data book and turned to a clean page.